up, team?
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to day 3 of the conference. My name is Ryan Kronk. I'm with the Water Institute. And this afternoon, we have in Redbud WaSH interventions. And first up, we have Nancy Ndirangu from Tetra Tech ARD. And as hopefully now everyone knows, welcome to the online audience as well. If you could, I'll run the microphone around unless you can sneak out to the podium for questions after you're done. So go ahead, take it away.
Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me? Okay. So welcome to this session. My name is Nancy Ndirangu. I work with Tetra Tech. I'll be talking to you about leveraging and strengthening market systems to professionalize water service delivery in Eastern DRC, Congo. I want to recognize contributors to this paper, Kelsey Dudziak and Caleb. And then we have a team of 2 gentlemen who also worked with us, Sebastian and Jos van Gastel. So just for objective, I will keep it short because I just want to share some experiences on how we are translating policy into practice in DRC, and then really respond to any issues that you may have, or maybe even your comments and maybe suggestions on how probably we can do it better. So basically, I'll just talk about the context of the activity, and if I can just go back a little bit. The activity is Sustainable Water and Sanitation Systems activity in the Eastern DRC. So I'll talk about the context, and then I will talk about some discussion of some of the results that we have found. So in terms of context, DRC is that big country in the center of Africa that actually has more than 50% of Africa's water. But the paradox is that less than 50% of the people have access to improved water services. So 27% like basic water access, 19% with safely managed services. So that's quite a paradox considering there is so much water there. So in 2022, the US government redesignated the DRC as a high priority country under the Global Water Strategy. mainly because of that context. And this problem is mostly pronounced in the rural and peri-urban areas. It's not really that good either in the urban areas, but the rural areas are worse hit. So basically, that is the context. The activity overview, it is funded by USAID. It's a 5-year program. We started in 2020, and it's going to end in 2025. And the goal is to improve sustainable and equitable access to safe water and sanitation for about 1.1 million people in North Kivu and South Kivu. The map on the right is showing the areas where we have been working. In North Kivu, we have 2 areas, maybe just to show, I think I'll be able to show from here. That is Beni in North Kivu, and this is Sakebweremana near Goma. And then in South Kivu, we have Kavumu Katana, and then we have Uvira towards the Lake Tanganyika. And then in terms of implementing partners, it's a consortium with Mexico in the lead, and then Tetra and Sanaje. So Mexico is the lead partner with a lot of the components in the project, and Tetra is leading with engineering and also with the MSD approach, and then Sanaje is doing sanitation, the sanitation part of it. So in terms of activity implementation approaches, oh, sorry. It's faster than me. So in terms of implementation approaches, the overriding approach is the market systems development approach, which is basically talking about the core of demand and supply, and then the rules, the governing rules, and then the supporting roles in the red zone. So that is the overriding approach. And the 5 principles, as you well know, is whole systems approach, systemic change, sustainable service delivery, facilitative change, and adaptive management. But within that, we also have a very strong sector relations and governance approach. And we actually have a whole component dealing with that. Stakeholder engagement for all the actors across the chain. Then we have infrastructure improvement approach, where we do assessment, then we prioritize, we plan, and then implement. And then running across, we have the CLA approach, where there is the collaboration with other partners, the learning and the adaptation of the learning. So basically, those are the approaches we have. And we have components now, like implementing all that. And then, of course, we have the cross-cutting themes like M&E and gender, communication, administration, all those roles are also cross-cutting. I won't talk about what we have done, but I'll talk about what drives our agenda. What drives our agenda is the water law in DRC, because the water law was done in 2015, but surprisingly, it was not implemented for a very long time. So when we came in, we started by really popularizing it and really making sure that stakeholders are aware of it and they know what they are supposed to do. So this presents an opportunity for growth of the sector because like many other water laws or reform processes for the water sector, it does the following things, like separation of the policy and regulation, decentralization, separation of asset ownership, delegation of service provision. But the good thing, it also recognizes the community-based water association. I say the good thing because that is the most common service delivery model. It also underscores the need for consumers to pay for water, and that is very good for the market-based approach. So somebody asked yesterday about stakeholder mapping, and we do have a lot of stakeholders. We have the government, the national government on top. Sorry. Again, it's faster than me. We have the national government on top. And then there we also have the regulatory authority. Then we have the provincial level and the local level. We have the provincial government, and then we have the decentralized territorial entities or ETDs. Okay. So that is what we are working with. We also have the water users, and we have the operators themselves. So basically what we are doing is we are supporting almost all the levels except the national level. We are supporting the provincial level, the decentralized entities, and also the operators. We are also supporting the Water User Association, and then all the other actors that are, especially the ones which are new. So if you check, you'll see the blue is the stakeholders, the yellowish is their roles and responsibilities, and then we have where we are supporting, and then we have where we have the new actors. So I want to share some experiences, and I only have a few minutes. But these challenges were mentioned before: the limited knowledge of the water law, the institutional framework, the limited capacity of the community-based model, inadequate infrastructure, the unwillingness of users to pay for services. Then there is the issue of limited data, over-reliance on donor funding and emergency response, resistance to institutional change, and insecurity. So results to date, I'll describe two and then a case study. So from this spectrum of contracting options, which are more general, from on the left we have the public-owned, on the right you have the private-owned. In the middle, you have the public-private partnerships, which is what the water law in DRC is focusing on. It's focusing on management, contract, affirmage, and concession. So based on that, we've been able to propose the arrangements that can happen. And the first one is a scenario where you have a direct contract between the contracting authority, which can be either the province or the ETD, and the private operator. So that can be a concession, an affirmage, or a management contract. I will be sharing an example if I will be given an extra minute. Okay. So, but we are also looking at a hybrid option where we have existing community-based organizations, and the hybrid option is one in which we then bring in a private operator or a professional manager to work with the community-based model. We also did a financial model of all those options that I have shown there. And it's based on like three things. the type of contraction model, the delineation of service area, and also the duration of the contract. So the takeaways are the importance of the contract duration. The longer the duration, the more feasible it is, and the lower the tariff. And then the other one is economies of scale. So we are clustering the smaller ones. The third one is they will need financial support, and then a lot of awareness and engagement with other stakeholders. The last slide is about the water operator in Mugunga Lake there, which is one of the areas near the city. And it's a private operator that was given a PPP contract by the Mayor of Goma in 2019 for 25 years. So they have the usual, sorry, oh my God. They have the usual challenges of demand and supply and population growth, especially because of IDPs. Then they took some loans, and the interest on loans is very high, and the expansion of service area of jurisdiction is also a problem. So what we do, we try to strengthen their operations within the context of the water law, so that at least some of the indicators on the right can actually improve, and maybe the tariff can go down a little bit. So that is all from me. Thank you very much.
Got time for maybe one quick question?
Thank you for the nice presentation. How did you find, in a context where there is unwillingness to pay the market system to operate? Thank you.
What we found is that in the community-based model, a lot of those users prefer to pay when there is a breakdown. So they do pay something, but not based on consumption. And then it's so unreliable that between the time when there is a breakdown and the time they collect the money, it can even take 3 months. And that time people don't have water. So we are trying to educate them about the importance of paying an affordable tariff, and we will support them to develop the model based on the financial model that we've shown, that will then take into account the clustering, the population, and a lot of other issues, so that it brings down the tariff to a reasonable level where they will then be able to pay. So the unwillingness to pay is actually based on the perception that water is free, because again of what we've been talking about during this conference, that a lot of the development partners that came there before were doing emergency response and just handing over the projects to the community. So they got used to that attitude of water is free, so why do you want us to pay for water? And then we are educating them on, you're not paying for the water, you are paying for the service of bringing the water closer to where you are, and better quality water for that matter. So they are actually slowly accepting.
Thank you so much. You want your PowerPoint? You want the PowerPoint and the PDF? Okay. All right, up next we have Erin Kowalsky from UNC.
Cool. Hi everyone, I'm Erin Kowalsky, and today I'm presenting my analysis entitled Long-Term Impact of an Urban Sanitation Intervention on Child Growth in Maputo, Mozambique, a project funded by the Gates Foundation analyzing an intervention implemented by Water and Sanitation for the Urban Poor, WaSH, with research collaboration alongside our in-country partners CISPOC and INS, as well as the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. First, some background. Maputo is the capital of Mozambique and is located on the coast. In the densely populated neighborhoods of urban Maputo, clusters of families live in informal compounds that share resources such as drinking water taps and sanitation. One such compound with 3 houses is depicted in the image shown. I will speak more about the sanitation infrastructure in these compounds. One example of sanitation before the organization WaSH selected compounds to construct intervention latrines is depicted. To select compounds for intervention, the criteria included factors such as truck access, water table level, and number of individual residents in the compounds. Sites that did not receive WaSH interventions but were eligible were established as control study sites by the study team. The WaSH design for the intervention sites who received the shared sanitation interventions consists of a pour flush latrine where water is added to flush the waste from the latrine to the septic tank, and the liquid effluent from the septic tank drains to the connected soak-away pit, as shown. The intervention takes 2 forms: a communal sanitation block, which is shown, and serves 20+ individuals, as well as a shared sanitation latrine that serves between 2 and 20 individuals. One thing to note is that these interventions take place in clusters of 2 to 10 households. This map shows all the compounds enrolled in the MAPSAN study, based on treatment arm, control, or intervention, showing the geographic locations of MAPSAN study neighborhoods and the densely packed compounds enrolled. I will additionally give background on anthropometric measurements. A secondary outcome of the MAPSAN study is to measure anthropometry, as enteric pathogen exposure has been associated with childhood growth faltering. The exact causal pathway and mechanisms of growth faltering is still hypothesized, but prominent theories include environmental enteric dysfunction, as well, which leads to epithelium damage affecting permeability, as well as newer theories such as the effects of specific pathogens such as Giardia or Cryptosporidium. Anthropometric measurements allow for an understanding of childhood growth outcomes based on reference to the 2006 WHO growth datasets, which were developed using data from 18 countries, allowing for development of growth curves, as displayed to the right. For this analysis, we are interested in both the continuous measures of growth z-scores, which include height for age, weight for height, and weight for age, as well as the binary cutoffs for these continuous measures, established by the WHO as less than 2 standard deviations from the median of the distribution, stunting, wasting, and underweight. A difference in difference analysis was conducted for baseline 12-month and 24-month rounds of the Maputo sanitation trial to understand the effects of the WaSH intervention. The trial looked at 13 enteric pathogens and included Cato-CATS analysis for helminths, as well as the secondary outcome of anthropometric measures. For more findings from the baseline 12-month and 24-month analysis, please follow up with Ni et al. 2021. That analysis of the Maputo sanitation interventions only found an effect on enteric pathogens such as Shigella and Trichoceres for children who were born into the intervention compounds through a subgroup analysis. So the motivation for the 60-month long-term follow-up is that consists of a cross-sectional analysis aimed to only enroll children born into intervention compounds. Eligibility includes any child 60 months old and younger who was born into intervention compounds and who hadn't traveled outside of the compound in the prior 6 months. Additionally, all compounds enrolled during previous rounds were revisited, and any eligible child under 60 months of age was enrolled. Children were all measured using standard methods established by the WHO, with measurements taken twice for accuracy. To understand the effects of the intervention on continuous measures, mean difference estimates were calculated using linear regression, with clustering accounted for using general estimating equations. Additionally, models were adjusted for pre-specified covariates such as age, sex, caregiver education, and wealth index. To understand the effects of the binary outcomes on the intervention, such as stunting, wasting, and underweight, Poisson regression was used to calculate prevalence ratios and additionally random effects and adjusting models for covariates. Let's take a look at the outcomes of the 60-month cross-sectional analysis in these kernel density plots. I will orient you to this figure and discuss the findings. The treatment arms are shown in the legend, with control in orange and intervention in purple. The x-axis shows the growth outcome z-scores from -6 standard deviations away from the mean to +6, including, and the shaded gray area shows the binary z-scores cutoffs from -2 to -6, indicating stunting, underweight, and wasting for each distribution. The lines indicate the median of each distribution, with control in orange and intervention displayed in purple. And here we can see that children in the intervention arm are generally growing taller, as seen by the shift in the distributions. Now let's take a look at the prevalence ratios for the binary outcomes, stunting, underweight, and wasting. Again, I will orient you to this figure. The adjusted models are shown in blue, with the unadjusted shown in pink. The null value of a prevalence ratio, 1, is shown by the dashed lines. And again, let's focus on the large reduction in stunting seen for the children born into the intervention compound compared to the children in control compounds. Additionally, we looked to past rounds of MapSan and calculated mean difference estimates and displayed kernel density plots for each previous phase of the MapSan study. These were open cohorts where any eligible child under 5 was enrolled and anthropometric measurements were taken. When you look in the highlighted panel, this shows each phase, and this shows again, the key difference. Each column shows a different study round, and the mean difference estimates are displayed. And the rows show the height for age z-score for each study round. In the text box, you are looking at the percentage of children born into the intervention. So for the 12-month study, 22% were born in, and in the 24-month study, 33% were born in. And then looking at our eligibility criteria for the 60-month follow-up, 100% were born in. For another way to look at this, these text boxes show the percentage of the average child's life exposed to the intervention for each MapSan round, emphasizing again that children in the 60-month follow-up were born into the intervention compounds and exposed the entirety of their lives. Excuse me. So we can see a significant increase in the mean height for age in children born into the intervention at 60 months, with a positive 0.31 mean difference estimate showing that the linear growth has improved for these children. This figure shows forest plots of the prevalence ratios and confidence intervals for the binary outcomes of the analysis, stunting, underweight, and wasting. Again, I will orient you to this figure. We see a significant reduction in stunting for the children born into the intervention compounds in the 60-month follow-up, and this reduction is about 30%. So in conclusion, we have seen a significant reduction in 60-month follow-up children that are born into the intervention compounds, showing greater linear growth with a mean difference of positive 0.31 for the children that again are born into this intervention site, as well as a 30% reduction in the binary cutoff for stunting. This aligns with recent findings from Benjamin Chung et al. 2023 that shows that early childhood is a critical window for linear growth outcomes, and interventions need to happen within the first 6 months of the child's life. These results also coincide with calls for transformative sanitation interventions and show the benefits of private shared sanitation in high-density settings. These interventions removed existing infrastructure, leading to a near 100% adherence to the intervention, and included hand-washing stations and water tap connections. Additional exploratory analyses will also be done, as well as we are really excitedly looking ahead to the pathogen data from this study. We are so thankful to all SysBoc enumerators and laboratory technicians who helped make this data collection possible. And I would like to acknowledge all participating organizations, our funders, and research collaborators for this work. And finally, looking ahead, for more information, you can come check out our site event tomorrow from 1:30 to 3 in the Sunflower Room. I'll happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much. It is very interesting research, also very controversial. I was wondering how you control the co-founders, like genetic factors, growth, weight, or undergrowth. Also, there are several co-founders, like even the housing conditions, the energy they are using at the household. And how do you control specifically genetic-related issues?
Thank you. I believe I got most of that question. So you're asking about addressing confounders in this analysis. So for these analyses, we pre-specified all covariates, which included child age, sex, caregiver education level, as well as the wealth index, which kind of accounted for a lot of the socioeconomic status that you're asking about. So the wealth index was calculated using the simple poverty scorecard established for Mozambique, which included 10 questions, and some of those questions addressed household size, as well as factors such as flooring and walls in the household. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you so much for this great presentation and for the exciting results. I'm more interested in what you probably presented about the impact of shared sanitation to the benefits in there. In the previous session, we've been talking about this, and I think one of the things we need you probably to point out more are the characteristics and how they maintain this to have this kind of, what's the quality of these shared sanitation facilities that you're talking about. Thank you.
Definitely. So I'll take you all the way back to the schematic kind of showing the design of the shared sanitation infrastructure. And so what's very amazing about this infrastructure is it was built for durability. And so if you attend our site event, you will be able to meet with WaSH, who will explain more about the actual infrastructure. But some key factors of this infrastructure is that there's a connected septic tank and a soakaway pit. So in theory, all waste is treated on site, and the children are never exposed to enteric pathogens. And so when I was in Maputo, I guess I was there most recently in June, this is a photo I took of the infrastructure. So I know you believe that this is the beginning of the intervention, but this is actually at minimum 5 years post-intervention implementation. So the infrastructure is very durable and I believe quite effective.
Congratulations for this groundbreaking work. We are in the post-WaSH benefits and shine period officially as of today. It's a huge deal. So yeah, just quick thoughts on reconciling these dramatic findings with the big nulls from WaSH benefits.
Yeah, so thank you so much for that question. So yeah, I think the key aspect of this, of these results is that we are looking at a intervention that included, as you're looking at, it includes a septic tank. It does not just an improved pit latrine. And another key factor of this intervention is that there was near 100% adherence to the intervention. And that is because when WaSH implemented these intervention latrines, they removed all existing intervention infrastructure. And also this intervention accounted for a lot of factors such as hand washing by including hand hand washing stations and connected water taps. So we're kind of looking at a transformative sanitation approach, which we believe is effective. Yes.
One more quick one. Anyone?
Just want to echo the excitement of these findings. I might just be interpreting this incorrectly, but when you were looking longitudinally of people who were enrolled for the full 60 months, were you seeing if there was a certain time point at which there was a divergence? Is it most critical during the first 2 years, or is it the effects only became apparent after the full 5 years of intervention?
Yeah, so thank you for that question. So for these analyses, we're looking at repeated cross-sections. And so the children in the 60-month were not in the previous rounds of this enrollment. And so this is this analysis is for children at each time point. And so that's what you're looking at here. Yes.
All right. Let's
Thank-
give Erin another hand.
Thank you.
All right, up next we've got June Samo from Millennium Water Alliance.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. How are you? I will be taking you to northern Kenya, a little bit away from Maputo, but that was excellent work, I have to say. So my name is June Samo, and I work with the Millennium Water Alliance. And we were interested in assessing the status of private sector participation in water service delivery in arid and semi-arid lands. And so I will just begin to give you the background of the project where we did that. So for the presentation, I'll quickly take you through the background, the objectives of the assessment, the methodology we used, some of the results that we gained, and the conclusions. So this particular assessment was conducted under a program that the Millennium Water Alliance is implementing in northern Kenya. We are working in 5 of the largest counties in Kenya, and just recently I learned that they occupy 47% of Kenya's landmass, so that's actually quite a large area that they cover. And under this program, our core aims are to increase access for 150,000 pastoralists, and the other core aim is to increase access to healthy rangelands for 50,000 pastoralists. So if you understand northern Kenya, they are mostly pastoralists and nomadic herders who live in these regions, and they are some of the most marginalized and poor communities. And pastoralism is their mainstay. So when we chose water and rangelands, it was very, very deliberate, because these were the measures that we saw could improve their lives. Just to give you a bit of a background, the arid and semi-arid lands of Kenya make up 89% of our land area, but they only host 38% of the population. So that means that the rest of the 11% of Kenya is hosting 62% of the population. So you can see how the population would be scarce in these areas. Then it carries 70% of the national livestock herd. As I mentioned, this is a pastoralist zone with an estimated annual value of 70 billion, which is good money in Kenya. Then their cells are home to 90% of Kenya's wildlife. Kenya is a tourist destination. It is a huge contributor to the GDP. So of course, these areas are very, very important and significant for Kenya. Then the region also has untapped solar and wind energy resources, as well as minerals. And I want to start by painting a positive picture, because it's not always good to start with the negatives, but we also have to be cognizant that there are some challenges in these regions. So in terms of development indicators, a study done by the World Bank under the North and Northeastern Development Initiative shows that across all development indicators, counties in their cells are performing more poorly. If you look at the access to safe water and improved sanitation, you will see that they only have 57% of the access rate and 72% compared to 72% nationally. Then in terms of sanitation, which of course is even lower, they have a 34% access rate compared to 59% for the whole country. But over and above that, the assaults have been systemically marginalized since independence of the country. There was a policy paper saying that these lands were wastelands, and for that matter, they were not developed for a very long time, until 2010. And then it's a challenging climatic environment. The country is just off the back of a 4-year drought, and this was where some of the most catastrophic drought effects were felt. There's rampant insecurity, so there's quite a bit of terrorism in the region, but it's reducing. And then there's generally chronic poverty, because if you see the development indicator above there, poverty is at 68% compared to the rest of the country at 36%. And this is from the national census conducted in 2019. So, there have been decades of concerted effort by development organizations and communities, but there's been minimal progress in fostering development in these regions. We are moving the needle, but it's been quite small. So if you remember, the government wasn't paying too much attention, so of course development partners had to step in. And then once the government began to pay attention, that was around 2010, the needle is still quite slow. So as Millennium Water Alliance, we asked ourselves, is there a possibility that we could look to the private sector? I mean, of course, seeing how the areas are, it might not be the most viable place for a private sector to work in. However, that is why we did the assessment to understand the area. So why the private sector? So just going by literature, the private sector creates 90% of all jobs in developing countries, according to the OECD. It accounts for 60% of the GDP in developing countries, and it also accounts for 80% of total international flows. For clients and consumers, they get better jobs, they get higher incomes, and they have empowerment and economic freedom. For the government, there are higher tax revenues, and then there's a running joke in Kenya that our government is really ready to tax us, and so this is quite encouraging to them. Unemployment decreases because there's job creation and there's poverty reduction. And then for the consumers, there are better goods and services because there are more players in the market, and there are real choices for the poor. So with that in mind, with the programs that MWA has been doing in Northern Kenya, we're not just exploring this from a development perspective and also working with the local governments. We're also very interested in getting private sector into water supply in those regions. But before that, for that to be done, we needed to understand a few variables. So we realized that it might be difficult to attract private sector players or augment the activities in these areas. As you've seen, I've already mentioned that they're quite marginalized and they're not really viable or they're not perceived as viable. Then the next thing is that there's not enough information on private sector participation in these areas. It doesn't exist. We did a lot of research. It's really hard to come by. It's starting to build up, but it's just very difficult to get it. So of course, because of that, we then decided to do an assessment. The key objectives of the assessment was to, one, evaluate the roles of existing private sector players. So if there are any, what exactly are they doing? The second thing was to determine the barriers to private sector participation in water services delivery in these areas. And the third thing was to propose a few strategies to augment the participation, and then of course try them out ourselves, see if they're working, and then come back and say this worked, this didn't work, and so on and so forth. So we're in the process of trying out things. So this is just the results up until the strategies. So in terms of the methodological approach, it was a purely qualitative study drawing insights from KIIs, key informant interviews, focus group discussions, and a review of some peer-reviewed literature, which, as I mentioned, was not too much, and gray literature reports from different entities. We conducted the typical literature reviews, desk reviews. We went to the field to collect data from various stakeholders, and then we also did a bit of data analysis. So in terms of the stakeholders who we targeted, we did quite a number of key informant interviews, about 183, but please take note that these are stakeholders across rangelands, across water resource management. So this is not representative of the water supply private stakeholders only. Then for the focus group discussions, we had them with entities like water committees, we had them with water resource user associations, and there were about 39. So what we did in terms of analysis is that the interview transcripts and field reports were deductively manually coded, deductively because we already had kind of our thematic areas which we wanted to see things fall into, and this responded to the 3 core objectives of the assignment. So what did we find? The first question was, what do they do? What if there are private sector players in northern Kenya? What exactly are their predominant roles? And based on the interviews that we carried out, there were two kinds of roles that were identified. So there were more common roles and there were more emerging roles. So for the common roles, we got this information from KIIs with development partners who predominantly work in the region, private sector players. We established that the common roles are generally equipment provision. If you're working for Save the Children, if you're working for CRS, most of the time you're buying a pump from a private sector player, you're buying a motor, a solar panel. This is really what they typically do in these areas. And even in the private sector players' minds, they're also all looking for this kind of business within northern Kenya. So that's a very common role. If you're setting up a desalination unit, you're buying membranes or things like that. Then the other thing is a broad service delivery. So within these counties, we have some sort of largish towns. So we have water utilities that operate there. Then we also have water tracking. These are this is done by small-scale private operators, so individuals who own trucks that take water in emergency situations. So that is still a business. Then we also have water treatment and bottling companies. This one came as a bit of a shock, but it seems that it's quite common in northern Kenya. The companies in Garissa, they work up all the way to Somalia. And then finally, we had water research and consulting. So as development partners working in this region, they have baseline evaluations, monitoring evaluations, impact evaluations, strategy development. It's a booming business. Like the research and consulting business for water is actually quite common in these areas. Then the more emerging private sector roles included the operation and maintenance providers. They are quite new, and this is because for the longest time in these regions, systems were built out. It was more on building infrastructure, not necessarily operating and maintaining the infrastructure. But now that's kind of the new thing that people are moving towards because they've realized there's a gap. And so the private sector is not only interested in selling the equipment, they're also interested in the maintenance of the equipment. Then we have water technology equipment financing, which is not only new in northern Kenya, it's actually new across Kenya. So we have banks and commercial entities developing lending products for the sector, for private sector entities, and that was a new thing. Then finally, we have provision of software. One would argue that this is not new, but it's not common in northern Kenya. So things like billing systems, telemetric systems for measuring things, measuring water levels, and generally just assessing the status of systems. So that's kind of the roles that we saw in northern Kenya for the private sector, divided into the more common roles and the more emerging roles. Then the second thing that we were trying to analyze was barriers to private sector participation. So here we used a combination of literature review and also some of the KIIs. So based on the literature assessment that we did, we adapted something. We tried to understand the type of market, and we realized that that could be a barrier to private sector participation. So we came up with this system of 4 quadrants where you have non-commercial markets, non-commercial areas with inadequate markets, commercial markets, and commercial markets with inadequate market systems. So for northern Kenya, it largely fell into 2 quadrants, the 2 at the bottom. So in the rural areas, you typically have customers who may not be able to afford the products, but also they're not supplied, or they're in areas not served by supply chains. So there are no roads to get to them, there are no shops to get to them, there's no way that a private sector can deliver their goods. And so such areas were non-commercial markets. And the other quadrant was for urban areas. So in urban areas, some of the populations do have the ability to afford. They can buy services. However, the supply chains are not robust. So you can see the kind of measures that you need to take. Then when Nancy started talking about the market systems development approach, I was very happy. So we used that to also evaluate the kind of markets that we had according to that approach, and it turned out that it was a bit of a thin market. So in terms of the market, it's a water supply market. So the core functions are supply of water, demand of water consumption. And then we have supporting functions in the form of infrastructure, information, skills and technology, and so on and so forth. So we assessed which of these functions was actually present. We see that there's a bit of strained infrastructure by way of roads, by way of actual reticulation networks. Skills and technology are broadly lacking unless they are imported from Nairobi or even other countries, but that's something that's being built out. And then in terms of the rules and the regulations, they exist. but they're not being used. And then the informal rules and norms are exclusive. So they don't cater for gender, they don't cater for people with disabilities. And so there was a bit of a dysfunction there. And so we classified it as a thin market. And so thin markets and markets that are non-commercial generally do not attract private sector participation. So if we were to resolve some of those market failures, then there would be more private sector participation. Then in terms of the KIIs, the key informant interviews, this looks pretty generic, but it is quite true. So lack of incentives or subsidies to promote private sector participation. So even on a small scale, private sector entities are not de-risked. So most of this information we got from our private sector partners, they want to go in. It's a bit dangerous. They just want a development partner to kind of de-risk them. However, that's not something that is being offered. Our development partners are moving to more direct implementation rather than working through entities like the private sector or the county government. So this lack of incentives, lack of subsidies was challenging. And even in the smallest way, there was a tax increment in bottled water, which then, of course, makes it difficult for the bottlers to participate in these areas. And then we have inadequate or incomplete regulatory frameworks that don't really stipulate how the private sector can work within these areas, and that's broadly even across Kenya, I would say. Then there's minimal water sector data. So this is things like on yields of the borehole, on the number of technicians in the counties, on how to register your business when you're in the county, on where to go to register your business. Such things just were not there. So when you go to the counties, you're not entirely sure what to do or how to start as a private sector partner. And then for these counties, they are massive. They occupy 47% of our country's area, and Turkana alone can fit Belgium twice. Like, that's how big one of those counties is. And so if you're a private sector entity trying to even work around them, it becomes quite challenging. And then the other thing is the insecurity. Of course, now you have to have added security detail when you're carrying out your work. So that also deters you from working there. Then finally, payment inefficiencies at county levels. Some of the counties in Kenya are new, so they're taking quite a long time to pay their suppliers. So private sector entities are kind of deterred by that. So the last one is the methods to stimulate private sector participation. Provision of risk guarantees at a smaller scale for smaller ticket projects. When I hear people talking about PPPs, it's at massive scale, but like this study really showcased the power of small. I sometimes don't like saying that, but like genuinely, if you have small private sector entities as development partners or even as NGOs, there is a possibility to de-risk at a smaller scale rather than, these massive arrangements that take a very long time. The contracting is very complex. So that's something to think about. Then use of subsidies, both demand side and supply side subsidies. So for supply side, it's for the private sector going into the region, and demand side is helping the consumers to purchase. You can see me on the side to discuss a demand side subsidy model we're doing. And then we also need to showcase the opportunity and viability of the region. So having products, information products on the region and the fact that it's viable and the models. There's a report that we've written that kind of shows the models that you can use in this region, the opportunities. So just really telling people about what's going on. And then finally focusing on local private sector entities. So there's a lot of focus and attention on the big private sector entities, international-based, Nairobi-based, but there are smaller entities within these counties that are already doing something that people need to think about. So in conclusion, it was very interesting to see the number of private sector players in the SALs and also the different roles they play. Then there is a very strong need to set up an enabling framework for their participation within these counties. And then risk financing and de-risking are still required, and quite urgently, I think, and that's the only way we can get them there. Then finally, I think the most important conclusion for me is that the private sector is not like the silver bullet for development. We still need the county governments to come in, we still need the national governments, we still need development partners to come in and support development in this region. So I would just like to thank our donor, the Swiss Agency for Development and Cooperation, and our various implementing partners, Care Kenya, Food for the Hungry, World Vision, CRS, and all the 5 county governments. Thank you very much for your time.
All right, thanks, June. We actually need to transition to our last speaker, but please come find June and our other speakers at the end. If you have follow-ups, And last up, we have Laura Kwong from University of California, Berkeley, and Kirk Dearden from Chorus. Take it away.
Good afternoon, everybody. Good to be awake. Everybody happy? I just want to make sure everybody's awake towards the end of the day. Good. I'm Kirk Dearden. I work at Chorus International, and I'll be co-presenting with Dr. Laura Kwong of UC Berkeley. Just want to acknowledge for a minute the support of the Osprey Foundation. They're present here today for this work, and work of Liz Thomas, who is also here, and Michel Dion from the International Livestock Research Institute, who couldn't make it. So I think some of this is well known by us in the room. 85% of fecal waste is from animals, according to the FAO. So addressing only human waste is missing a good part of the problem. As we also know, in a lot of low-income countries, rural households tend to keep animals for a variety of reasons, to provide eggs, meat, milk, cash, and lots of other reasons. A little hard to see for me. I guess I could always look down. So the impact of prior WaSH interventions may have been limited, partly because we haven't adequately addressed animal feces and management of animals. And so if we're going to address those issues, we need to take a more holistic One Health approach. So the objective of this work was to develop and evaluate an animal-inclusive, community-led total sanitation project. CLTS doesn't normally include animal management in its program, and we thought it was very important to do that. We had 3 research questions. One is, what are current animal husbandry and animal waste management strategies? How can animal husbandry and animal waste management strategies be incorporated into CLTS? And then what is the impact of integrating animal issues into CLTS? So we used a variety of methods. We're reporting on just a couple today. We thought there was one on. We have another slide, I'm not seeing it, about the various methods we use. I don't know whether, is it missing? Yeah, we have a slide that describes, the in-depth interviews and the key informant interviews and the mapping and all of that. For some reason, it didn't make it on. But in addition to all of those research methods, we also conducted a series of workshops to help design the intervention to be more inclusive of animal management practices. So in 3 villages, we conducted workshops with a variety of individuals listed there. And through the research, we'd identified a number of problems related to animal management. And so we listed those out and had people prioritize them, both at the community level and then at a larger workshop with national level stakeholders. And then we also had the National Sanitation Committee conduct routine monitoring. I don't know where is this slide 10? No. I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Laura Kwong for the remainder.
Okay, great. Sorry, so the slide that was missing was sort of about the initial formative, villages. We went to 5 villages and interviewed a number of people, including animal caregivers and child caregivers in those to understand how they were interacting with animals. So some of the findings were that the value of livestock, again, many of us know this but don't really think about it, right? It's like, why does every household have an animal? Because they're extremely valuable for labor, milk, meat, cash, religious events, dowries when you're getting married, and where are people keeping those animals at night? So in the daytime, it really varied from season and among different participants, but generally during the rainy season, cattle, sheep, and goats spent the days grazing, and then they were outside the village, but in the dry season, they were more often moved to other locations around the house. So it's helpful to understand sort of like a schematic of the house and where are these animals. So the animals that are kind of in black are confined and the ones that are in white are unconfined. So during the day, everyone's just roaming around, right? You have animals that are roaming outside the village, animals that are roaming in the compound, animals that are roaming sort of like right inside the household area. And during the night, you'll have more confinement of animals. Some are confined outside the village, some outside the compound, some confined sort of inside the compound. Right, so just remember, animals are everywhere. And what does that look like? It looks like a lot of poop everywhere. So Kirk kind of brushed past by that first point, but I think many of us do not think about 85% of all feces coming from animals, right? Pretty much we just talk about human poop and child poop and other adult poop and where the poop goes, but like we're always talking about human poop, and there's a lot of poop that is not from humans. That is relevant to think about, right? So there's some systematic reviews thinking about or quantifying what pathogens are in animals and the prevalence of animals infected. So a lot of animals in this setting and a lot of animal poop. So these are the confinement structures for cattle, and they were often kept away from the house, but small ruminants were not. And one reason is because people are really afraid of theft. Right? You don't want your goats and sheep, which is your value, to just disappear. And so they make confinement structures quite near the household, and you can see them here. And again, the soil is like sandy colored. The poop is all the black colored, right? So you can see it's really scattered around. And I'm not I'm not trying to make households look bad. This is just how life works because you got a lot of animals and it takes a lot of work, right? And so our strategy was to help them figure out how they could maybe confine that poop more easily, right? Because there's a lot of work to take care of so many animals. So in terms of livestock husbandry, we were interested in types of engagement, not only with animal feces management, but with animals themselves. And we varied this by looking at adult men, adult women, and girls and boys. So in terms of watering, animals were sharing the same water sources as people, both in the dry season and in the rainy season. Feeding, men and children were involved in pasturing livestock. Women were in charge of feeding dogs, watering small ruminants, and children were in charge of caring for pigeons. Chickens just fended for themselves, and there was a lot of scavenging by other animals. And this scavenging, again, I think it's not a surprise when you see it. You're like, oh yeah, that's what it looks like. But when you remember that it is someone's cooking pot, right? And that is somewhere that a child plays, you're like, oh, that's maybe not a good sign, right? And what can we do to sort of help change these behaviors so there's less contact between humans and animals? So there's also contact between children and animal products. And this can be from milking. During the process of milking, both the process of the milk, having the milk in the containers, and then the milk not being pasteurized before consumption, adults being involved in the birthing of animals and sometimes using those placentas afterwards for different purposes, having sick animals that maybe were slaughtered before death, but the meat may still be consumed, right? It's not like there's a lot of meat around in the area, and so it's really important to take advantage of your resources, and some of that might be meat from an animal even that died from an unknown disease, or was slaughtered prior to dying from an unknown disease. And thinking about slaughtering practices as well. So men might slaughter the animal, but children were responsible for cleaning the intestines, right? So of course there's a lot of contact with that sort of fecal waste that's still in the animal before it comes out. Women were in charge of cooking meat, and that slaughter waste was combined with manure. So again, thinking about animal waste, not just the animal feces, right, but a more comprehensive understanding of like what is animal waste. Similarly with carcasses, men and children were responsible of disposing of carcasses either in pits or old wells or disposing them far from the village, but it involved a lot of contact. And then children would often play near or with animal feces because they're fun to play with. So that was a common thing that was seen in these 5 villages. In terms of animal feces management, men would manage cattle, donkey, and horse manure, collect it once a year before the rainy season and disperse on the crop fields, whereas women were in charge of ruminants and poultry, and they would collect it more frequently and use it for home gardens. Manure was often in pits to prevent child interaction, and that was at baseline. Not all of it, but sometimes that was seen. And some farmers did already practice composting. Children were often in contact with animal waste. Again, here there's pictures of children playing or pictures of children playing in the areas where animals were sometimes tied up. And there was an understanding of animal sickness. Respondents were aware of animal symptoms and stated some symptoms used to identify sick animals. Male household heads were often making decisions about animal vaccination, but the fees were sometimes paid by the owner of the animal, so sometimes the woman would be considered the owner of the sort of poultry and need to pay that fee. Cattle were vaccinated at large gatherings, and small ruminants and poultry were vaccinated by the vet or farmer. And often treatments with antibiotics were done by the farmer themselves. So there was some recognition that animals could be sick, but there was less recognition that that illness among animals could be transferred to human, right? Thinking about the zoonotic transmission, that understanding was relatively low. In most focus group discussions, people did share that, yeah, we think animal feces can make you sick due to flies and mosquitoes interacting with that feces. And the idea was that the sickness that could be caused would be malaria, colds, stomach aches, and headaches. In some in-depth interviews, participants shared that they were aware that disease could move from animals to human, but unclear sort of what the diseases were or how they were transmitted. And it was also important to consider when setting up, an animal-inclusive CLTS intervention, what are existing perceptions of human and animal feces, and how could those be leveraged in the intervention itself. So people found human feces to be more disgusting and bothersome than animal feces. In terms of the offensiveness of their odor, right, it was humans and then poultry and then dogs and cats and then small ruminants and then cattle. And 5 of the 8 participants said that they would eat food if, flies had recently landed on cattle or small ruminant feces and then on the food because they had more affection for those species. So these were important considerations when thinking about the development of the triggering process, for example. So after the formative work, some conclusions were, these were the main problems sort of identified with the research team in conversation with the community, right? So there were these community workshops where we shared sort of, here's the findings of these interactive activities with your own community. What do you think about these problems? And people sort of pointed out the problems they thought were maybe most important or most tractable, or what they could come up with solutions for and what would be difficult. And so there's everything from, food to lack of contamination sites, lack of containment sites for animals, management of animal carcasses, slaughtering and calving, and just thinking about hygienic practices around those. Sick animals that are often left at home when the healthy animals went out to graze, or maybe healthy animals were confined in a different place than sick animals. How to hygienically spread manure on crops, how to think about the meat from those slaughtered animals, milk contamination, children playing in areas that animals had recently been or with animal feces, children's other contact with animals through those watering, feeding, taking care of the animals' activities, and the low knowledge of composting and zoonotic diseases. And so some of the candidate interventions that sort of we decided to focus on, not just our research team, but again in conversation with local stakeholders and national stakeholders about what would be feasible, acceptable, and culturally sort of allowed in these communities, were focusing on composting and doing training on composting techniques, focusing on the problem of sort of the lack of containment sites and thinking about how communities could improve or construct confinement sites. But there was a note that this was difficult due to a lack of natural resources. And also thinking about the risks to children from playing in areas with animals or animal feces. And communities talked about how they could increase supervision, maybe use play mats, maybe use a creche, sort of like a daycare facility type situation, but a lack of financing was noted as a major barrier to this. So the value of that formative work is we were able to take both the insights of sort of what people saw as problems, what were people seeing as risks and as barriers, and use it in an animal-inclusive CLTS. So the triggering, which is at the start of CLTS, to sort of get everybody thinking about feces in the environment, thinking about the need to address feces in the environment, included the normal CLTS process of village mapping, but we didn't just do mapping of human feces, we did mapping of human and animal feces. It wasn't just mapping of human defecation sites, it was human defecation sites and animal confinement sites, which have a lot of animal feces in them, right? In addition to thinking about fecal oral contamination exercises, not just with human feces, right, but also with poultry feces, and then estimating feces produced, medical expenses, and environmental walk that also included animal sites. And then post-triggering, there was training for village sanitation committees on composting techniques, construction of manure pits, and sort of confinement structures, improved confinement structures. And there was training for para-veterinarians, sort of like not state-level veterinarians, but more local-level veterinarians on biosecurity and One Health, and how to engage with village sanitation communities about that, right? So again, trying to bring One Health people together. And so the evaluation, there were 5 villages in a CLTS-only arm, 10 villages in an animal management arm, where it was like first they got CLTS, and then several months later they got an animal add-on. And then there was one where there was a concurrent, right? You get everybody together, and so when you're talking about feces, you're always talking about both human and animal at the same time. And the outcomes were intended to be the percent of households with animal feces in the living area, and the percent of households that safely dispose of animal feces. So it was COVID times, and there is some unrest in this area of Mali, and so we were not able to conduct the household evaluation as planned. So what we have used as results is from the sort of National Sanitation Committee that kind of essentially did a third-party evaluation. They went to villages and were going to certify them as open defecation free or not. And so here's the criteria they used for open defecation free, right? It's the typical sort of CLTS open defecation free criteria where each family has a latrine, with a cover on it. Household members report using the latrine. The latrine has a hand washing station, and child under 5 use defecation pots. But in these villages where we had animals included as well, the requirement was that 75% of households had to have good animal feces management for the village to be described as ODF, right? Open defecation free when feces include human and animals. And so there was some difference in the timing after triggering when the evaluation happened. And so it's obviously very difficult to compare CLTS only here. But it is promising to see that 6 out of 10 villages, 6 months after triggering, did have ODF free, right? So that a large number of households were following good animal management practices in addition to those human feces practices that we would consider. So the implications are that community engagement was really important, and I think many of us know that and do that, but this was new to our veterinarian colleagues. And they would thought, oh, that community engagement stuff, that was really novel. So I'm not saying it's new to all veterinarians, but to our colleagues it was new, and so there was a lot of cross-learning. Us about sort of veterinary practices and the importance of what to consider in animal husbandry, and them sometimes in how we think about things over in the human side of WaSH. We documented extensive contact with animals that differed by age and gender, and were able to look at feasible interventions in Mali, looking at confinement structures and composting. And then we're also able to work with the National Sanitation Committee and thinking about how to most effectively incorporate animals into CLTS. And then lastly, really thinking about who is benefiting from an intervention and who is responsible for doing that intervention, right? If women are in charge of chickens, but men are supposed to build the chicken coop, right? Like you might need to involve each other and do some inter-household dynamics in thinking about that. And then finally, sort of as the main takeaways, there's a lot of animal poop out there, right? Probably any location you work in a global setting, there's a lot of animal poop out there, whether it's urban or even in a rural setting. So if you're not considering interactions with animal or animal feces or other types of animal waste, that slaughtering waste, you're probably missing out on a lot of pathways. Another is that we talk about One Health, but we don't integrate that much yet. We still have the opportunity to integrate more, and that could be in research, program design, and implementation. And when we do that, really thinking about how different gender roles and ages are impacted differently, considering who is responsible could be really helpful. The QR code is to a training manual that our veterinarian friends made on improving biosecurity of small-scale livestock production. So I encourage you to check that out and incorporate it maybe into your next WaSH program, whether you intend it to be One Health or not. I think there's important recognition that we're going to have to address animal feces if we're going to make progress that we want to see. Okay, sorry, it was a little bit long, but I think there might be 1 minute for questions.
Questions?
Wow, no questions, really? It was so absolutely clear.
Thank you. This was excellent.
Great.
But that's my jam. So I had a question about with the slaughterhouse, looking at that as a potential exposure pathway. Did you find that a lot of the offal is fed to dogs? I've had that's been my experience in looking at kind of the way that different animal parts are disposed of or reused or integrated in compost, and what parts are actually fed to other animals?
That is a great question. I was never able to go to Mali during this project because of COVID. I don't know that my two colleagues here know either, but we will check in with our veterinarians. We're able to like train the observation team and do the observations because I'm not sure if it was fed, cleaned and used as human food or used as animal food again. Yeah, that's a really good question with parts going back and forth.
All right. I'm standing between you and happy hour. So please come find our presenters if you have follow-up questions, and let's give them all one more round of applause.